There's never a bad time to start a podcast. And if you're itching to get your microphone out and hit record, then chances are you've got a great message that's worth sharing. However, there are always steps you can take to set yourself up for success and ensure your first episode lands with a bang instead of a crash. In this episode, we're going to go through the questions you need to ask yourself before you give yourself the green light to start creating the podcast of your dreams. And make sure to stick around at the end as we address the number one mistake podcasters make when launching their podcast and what you can do to avoid it. Now, taking the leap into the podcasting world can be daunting, but luckily, starting, growing, and even making money off of your podcast has never been easier. But before you start, it is important to do some self-reflection to better understand why you've been feeling this pull to enter the world of podcasting in the first place. So, are you ready for those questions? Let's get started. The first question you should ask is, what's my overarching goal? Before you start podcasting, it's a good idea to take some time and figure out what you're trying to achieve with your podcast. The answer doesn't necessarily have to be groundbreaking. In fact, your goal could be to have fun. But knowing this before you start doing the work can help you make creative decisions moving forward and allow you to keep everything in perspective. Now, a great way to narrow down your focus is to journal about your goals and values as a person or organization and determine what kind of impact you want to make with your personal or professional brand. Some underlying goals could be brand storytelling, connecting with like-minded industry leaders, positioning yourself as an expert in your field, and/or converting customers into listeners and/or clients. Understanding your ultimate goal is important. How you start, market, and grow your podcast will vary greatly if your ultimate goal is just to have fun versus if your goal is to make a full-time income from your podcast. Now, the second question you should ask is, what topics will I cover? While you don't necessarily have to choose one narrow window of subject matter for your podcast and never stray from it, it can be helpful to choose one or two anchor topics for your show so you have a rough sense of the subjects that you'd like to talk about. This will help you stay focused as your podcast progresses so you can remain consistent and build a following over time. You might be asking right now, well, why does this matter? Well, let's look at an example. If your topic is wellness, you might want to choose 2 or 3 of your favorite subjects to focus on to start so people can get to know you and connect with you. You may choose to stay within the confines of nutrition and mindset as a start, and then you can slowly start to branch off into more niche topics as you gain a following and people trust that you will deliver top-notch content no matter what you're talking about. However, remember that if your topic is wellness, then you need to stick with it until the very end. Don't suddenly start talking about anime or politics. If you do lose interest in your topic, then maybe you should consider starting a whole new podcast. Remember that switching themes or topics can confuse and alienate your listeners, which is something you do not want to do. The third question we're going to ask is, who is my ideal listener? Guess what? You can't talk to everyone, and your listener cannot be everyone and anyone. This is why identifying your ideal listener is so important. Drilling down on the type of audience you'd like to attract for your podcast can help you determine the proper tone, episode flow, and subject matter you will cover moving forward. If you know who you're speaking to and why, then it'll be a lot easier to keep your end audience in mind when you create each episode from their perspective. In the end, it's all about your listeners, so make sure you know who they are inside and out. When creating your ideal listener, consider things like demographics, age, location, interests, and values, and also psychographics, which are psychological aspects of your listener's personality. This can include aspirations, values, attitudes, and personality. Understanding who is tuning into your podcast is incredibly important, especially if you want to grow your podcast listenership and if you want to make money off of your podcast in the future. Our fourth question that we're going to ask is, do I have all the equipment I need? All you really need to start your podcast is your laptop and a pair of earphones. But if you want to make a professional impression from the get-go, you'll likely want to take stock of the equipment you already have on hand and what you'll need to make your first episode sound amazing. Remember, you don't need to spend a lot of money to make sure your podcast sounds great. There are many budget-friendly microphones and headphone options out there, and you can always either edit your podcast yourself or hire someone to do it for you on Fiverr. Whatever you do, don't break the bank right away, especially if you're still learning the ropes. You can always purchase more equipment down the road to celebrate once you start hitting your podcasting goals. Now, the last question that you should ask yourself is, how will I promote my podcast? Even if your podcast episode is chock full of amazing information, you will still have to spread the word. A lot of people don't realize this, but the hardest part of podcasting is not launching your podcast, but marketing your podcast. Growing a listenership is hard, so it is a good idea to spend some time thinking about the channels and tactics you'll use to promote your podcast to draw in new listeners and subscribers. How can you do that? Well, remember how we talked about creating your ideal listener? If you've done your research, then you probably know where your listeners are hanging out. So why don't you join them? If your listeners are Gen Zers, then you probably should be promoting your podcast on social media channels like Instagram or TikTok. However, if your listeners are 50 plus retirees, then creating a TikTok account doesn't really make sense. You cannot be everywhere, so choose wisely. Whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Discord, Reddit, Instagram, or TikTok, make sure that your ideal listener is hanging out on that specific platform. On top of being on social media, you can also start a website where you share post show notes and descriptions, transcriptions, and a blog, which comes in handy in terms of search engine optimization or SEO. A website is also a great place to gather email addresses. You can use those email addresses to connect with your community by sending out a weekly or bi-weekly email newsletter to keep your followers in the loop and up to speed on your podcast's happenings. Whatever marketing strategy you plan on implementing, remember one key element. Digital marketing is a marathon and not a sprint. To be successful, you need to put in consistent effort and work. Although you probably would love to go viral, who wouldn't? Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way. It might feel like it's taking a long time, but building a community takes time and work. Make sure you are consistent and stick with it because in the end, you will reap the benefits. Now that we've got those 5 questions out of the way, let's address the number one mistake podcasters make when launching their podcast and what you can do to avoid it. Are you ready? You are not the star of the show, your audience is. The sad reality is that unless you are Oprah or Brad Pitt, listeners are not going to tune into your podcast just to hear what you have to say. There needs to be a reason why they're listening. So unless you're a celebrity, talking about your day or what frustrates you might not be the best strategy when launching your podcast. Instead, flip the script and ask yourself, what kind of content would your ideal listener be interested in listening to? Everything begins and ends with your audience. And it is important to understand not only who they are, but what would drive them to listen to your podcast. Make sure you take the time to do your research, identify your audience, and create something unique. Yes, you need to identify your audience, but you also need to know what your podcast differentiator will be because you want your podcast to stand out from the crowd. And there you have it. Before you hit record, make sure you ask yourself these 5 critical questions. Reflecting on your overall values, interests, and aims at both a personal and professional level can help you better understand why you've been feeling the pull to enter the world of podcasting in the first place. And it will motivate you to keep and stay consistent while you move forward. If you love this video and want to see more, smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell to be notified when we share a new video. And if you have any questions, please comment below and we'll be more than happy to answer them in a future video. Until next time, happy podcasting.